Hello, friends. Welcome to a little bit different adventure today. Since it's October, going to play a lot more games of a scary or horror related event using some of the lists of really great horror games on the web. And here's one I was not aware of. It's called My Father's Long, Long Legs by Michael Lutz. So apparently this is a text-based click adventure, and we're going to find out what it's all about, because this was the first one on the list. So my intention through this month is to play as many scary games as possible in an hour, hour and a half, 2 hour segments, depending on the length of the game. I don't think this one's that long, but I could be wrong. I've never played this one before. I'd actually intended on playing something else, but I was not able to find clearance to play the game today. So it kind of threw me for a loop, so I figured I would try this one. So, since this is text-based, I will read what it says and read our choices. And here we go. It says, my family lived on the southern edge of a certain Midwestern industrial city in an old house, old enough that its basement still had a dirt floor. Must have been in Michigan. I was not yet old enough to openly question a parent's behavior, but certainly old enough to recognize its oddness when my father began digging. I retain only a single clear memory of the time before the situation became alarming, and my father forsook sunlight forever. I'm sitting at the bottom of the wooden stairs that led down to our basement. Ahead in the dimness stands my father, up to his waist in the hole. Sounds very ominous already. Still in his dark blue uniform from the factory, skin and fabric blackened by the hot breath of machinery and further smudged now by the damp earth. I watch father with the satisfaction of a child who sees in her parent a well of limitless capability. Upstairs, my mother called out that dinner is done. My father takes one last shovel of earth, turns it over the side of the excavation, and in a single, incredible motion crawls out of the hole simply by pressing the sole of his boot on the lip of the pit, moving his whole body upward, walking right past me, right up the stairs. He was always tall. He was always a tall, angular man, as the remaining pictures of him suggest, and to this day I can clearly conjure a marvelous image of my father's long, long legs striding over me as he emerged from the hole he was to spend years digging beneath our house. Apart from him, there were three of us: my mother, my younger brother, and myself. There are many things about my mother I do not understand. She first found my father attractive. She admitted to me many years later because of how unusual he was. He had come to the Midwestern industrial town and secured a job at the same factory where my mother was working. Though a practical man, he read constantly and voraciously in subjects ranging from engine repair to philosophy, a habit instilled in him, he claimed, by his own parents. This was all my father ever said of his family beyond us. Any further inquiry into the subject caused him to leave the room or bring up some other pressing issue. Mother once theorized that father had run away from home. Whatever his reasons for leaving his family behind, my father did not wait too long before beginning a new one. I was born only a few months after my parents were married. Oh. Within a few years, my father had made enough money that my mother could stay at home and watch over me and not too long after, my brother. Clickable, or am I going to have to go up? Then one night, when my brother was perhaps only a year old, Father came home, pulled a brand new shovel from the back of his pickup truck, and descended into the basement where he began to dig. At first, he told Mother that he was preparing to put down a cement floor, suggesting a prelude to a full or partial renovation of the house. As a child, the movements of adults were still largely mysterious to me, and I do not know the specific circumstances under which mothers realized this motivation was untrue. Nor do I know exactly what transpired when Father told Mother that they must go to the basement to discuss the matter closer to its source, for after the door shut behind them, my brother and I were left alone in the house. My brother cried most of the night while I lay in my own bed, pillows pressed to my ears. The next day my mother reappeared, quietly prepared our meals, and then locked herself in her bedroom shortly before Father returned home and commenced digging once again. My father, for his part, stopped sleeping in the bedroom with her, instead taking to the basement, a decision which coincided with the first signs of his terrible metamorphosis. The changes were slow, but noticeable. Father began to grow paler, and by the time the factory closed, he could spend the whole day in the basement. He was white as chalk. Perhaps it was this general evidence of wear, the change in skin tone, and his subsequent emaciation that made him look taller, as if his height increased in proportion to the depth of his project in the basement. Meanwhile, my mother put my brother into preschool and sent me to a latchkey program while she worked to support us. In what seemed like a deliberate contrast to my father, she grew somehow darker and smaller. My father dug uninterrupted in the basement for at least a decade, and once I started high school, he did not even leave the basement to join us for dinner. Then my mother left him. I feel like we should know something about the brother. My father was sufficiently enveloped in his life's task, that there was no need to replay the arguments from my childhood. Whatever desire he once had to keep us home with him had apparently fallen away, lost in the depths of that pit. On her own, Mother seemed to physically decompress, to become less bowed. She spoke more, laughed more. She had friends and lovers. We did not see my father at all after we left. On the day we left for good, he did not even come out of the basement, though by that point it was questionable how easily he could get through the doorway, so tall he had grown. It was not until many years later that my brother suggested we pay a return visit to our father's house. Needless to say, my brother and I had different experiences of our early home life. My brother was young enough when Father began digging that it seemed to him in a different fact of life. It seemed obvious to me that something was wrong with our home. Its wrongness was screamed, I thought, by the chilly terseness with which our mother had moved through it, returning home from work in the late afternoon, serving meals, and retiring to her bedroom. The wrongness was screamed, of course, by my father, who, after losing his job at the factory, spent nearly all day in the basement, emerging at irregular intervals to eat and use the toilet. This is to say nothing of the physical changes he underwent as time went on. The wrongness was screamed by my own actions, the heavy worry I felt that at any moment the fragile equilibrium of our home would be upset, and my brother's friends would witness the terrifying truth of our family's situation, a situation I myself could not begin to articulate, but which I felt ashamedly that an outsider would. Of course, my brother, young as he was, saw nothing wrong with inviting his friends to our home, and even taking them down to the basement to see what he called, after our father's example, I believe, the renovations. The friends never asked to return to the basement after my brother took them down there. Some of them quietly deigned to never return to our house at all, much to my relief, though my brother was often disappointed. I only recall one instance when my brother was perhaps 7 when one of his playmates made a scene. I believe my brother's friend came from a religious family, which may have been part of the problem, but that may also be something I recognized only due to my own biases. At any rate, though his cosmology was different from my own, he at least shared some of my anxieties when he attempted to explain to my brother that our father's project in the basement was deeply unnatural. I emerged from the living room because down the hall I could hear crying. I knew that my brother had a friend over, and so was prepared for the worst. The 2 boys stood outside the door to the basement, which still stood open. My brother looked up as I approached, at a loss as to how to comfort his weeping companion. "You're going to hell," our visitor informed me, after I managed to get him to look at me. "That's where he's digging to down there," the child said, looking from me to my brother. "He's digging to hell, and you're all going with him." My brother did not invite as many classmates over after that day, and I don't believe he ever invited any of them down to see the renovations ever again. "Are we really going to hell?" he asked me one night, lying beside me in bed after a nightmare sent him to my room. I told him I did not know. "But is that where Dad is digging to?" he asked. I told him there was no such place. "Then why is Dad digging?" In the early days, when I sat on the stairs and watched him work, my father had given me dozens of flippant reasons for his project, seeking dinosaur bones. All of these excuses had lost currency by this point, of course, and when asked what he was doing, as my brother told me, his religious visitor had inquired, my father had other things to say. Expanding the basement for a spare bedroom or recreational space, looking for buried treasure, hoping to strike oil, suspecting a natural hot spring flowed beneath our house. These are all the reasons. "This is not the real world," my father would say, or something along those lines. What we think is the real world is just a layer of dirt caked around the true core of the universe. And what is dirt? Inert matter, dead weight, the remains of those who came and went before us, content only to further press down upon creation with their waste. There was a time when human beings were giants, walking upon a small earth, but now the earth has grown fat and hateful with our soil, while we have grown small. Starting here, I am scraping away all the sediment, our coagulated filth, and returning us to our original glory. I assemble this manifesto from memory, from various iterations and variations Father offered us over the years, and certainly it was the sort of heresy that had offended my brother's erstwhile friend. Still, they were not satisfactory answers to us then, and would not be satisfactory for my brother as he huddled fearing hell in my bed. But frankly, I had no other answer for him, and let the matter lapse into silence, which is perhaps why all those years later he urged me to come with him back to our father's house. Of course, my experiences played a part in my eventual decision. A year or so before we left my father was the last time I ventured down in the basement. My brother was out with friends, having reached the age when he finally realized the awkwardness that resulted from bringing visitors to our home, and Mother had locked the door to her room and apparently gone to bed. Father was, of course, laboring in the basement, and I was doing homework in the living room while watching television. There came a knock at the door. man on the porch was squat, but dressed neatly in a suit, coat, and hat. A pair of very small spectacles was perched on the end of his nose, looking minuscule in comparison to his large, round face. "Hello, young lady," he said to me in a labored voice. "Is your father home?" "Who are you?" I asked. The man tipped his old-fashioned hat back on his head, smiled with rubbery lips. "You would have no reason to know me, of course," he said, "but I am your uncle." I left the man on the porch, the door locked, while I went to seek my mother's help. Thus I discovered she was unresponsive, as she often was in those days. This left me with the only option to summon my father from the basement. He did not respond when I opened the door and yelled down, though I thought I could hear faintly the sound of his digging. I looked back to the front door, where I could see through the pebbled glass the rotund figure of the man who claimed to be my uncle, and descended the wooden stairs into the basement. The only light, as always, came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. My father had learned to operate in these conditions, but for me, the lack of illumination cast the labyrinth below into a mess of confusing and seemingly contradictory paths of damp black earth and only slightly blacker shadow. Father had first attempted to dig straight down, but as the years went on, he elaborated his original plan, angling outward from the center of the basement at a depth of perhaps 15 feet. From there, he had begun to hollow out the entirety of the basement with one long looping path, threaded and bent around itself like some monstrous length of viscera, all the while continuing his march downward. I stood on the bottommost stair that, as I thought of it, still properly belonged to our house. By my feet was a stack of unfamiliar books. They were old, with blank but warped brown covers. Next to them was what appeared to be an antique child's rattle, caked with dirt, and several rocks chipped into various unnatural but vaguely instrumental shapes. I turned to the void and called for my father. No response came, but I grew more certain that I could hear, however distantly, the sound of my father's shovel. I called for him again, this time giving also my purpose for interrupting his work. "There's a man at the door," I said. "He says he's my uncle." I stood and waited, and as I did so, the sound of digging stopped. My father emerged a minute or so later, unfolding himself from the narrow bends of his maze, his pale skin covered only by the rags of his clothing, and everywhere dusted gray with soil, including, I noted, the corners of his mouth, which seemed stained particularly thoroughly and much more darkly. "Your uncle," Father rumbled, not quite asking a question. He then added, "My brother." I nodded. "Show him in," he ordered. The squat stranger, my uncle, who I remember smelled of sour milk, seemed elated at his prospects. I led him down the basement stairs, his agitation growing exponentially until he saw my father standing at his full height. Must have been at least 8 or 9 feet then, I think, at the entrance of his renovations. I knew to take my leave, and as I ascended the stairs, I heard the visitor remark that my father seemed to have done very well for himself, all things considered. I never again saw the man who claimed to be my uncle, either that day or any day after. Perhaps not coincidentally, this is also my last clear memory of my father, and the one that returned to me so many years later when my brother suggested we return to our father's house. It seemed my brother wanted to put his mind at ease by checking up on our father, who had been left alone now for slightly longer than we had lived with him. On the one hand, I appreciated my brother's sentiment, even if I felt it was misplaced. On the other hand, I knew I could not stop him. His feelings towards father had always been more lenient. The only question was, would I go with him, or let him make the trip on his own? So here we have to make a choice. Do we go with him, or do we let him go by himself? I think we need to go with him. We decided upon a day to visit our childhood home, where we assumed our father still lived, and decided to meet there one afternoon the following week. But there must have been a miscommunication somewhere. I was late. I must have been late. The alternative is that, for his own purposes, my brother arrived early to see our father before I did, and I do not wish to contemplate why that would be. The town was considerably less industrial than it had been, though the taste of industry still laced our water and air. The old neighborhood, not the most affluent even in former times, had fallen into further disrepair. The houses up and down the block stood weathered, and it seemed empty. The sidewalk buckled around the thick protrusions of sickly weeds, which reached out into the pot-holed streets, protruding fingers of the overgrown lawns. The only signs of habitation was a single car, my brother's car, parked outside our old home. The doors were locked, the windows rolled up. A hand pressed to the hood told me it was not warm, but apart from that I had no way of guessing how long the vehicle had been there unattended. Ahead, the house waited. It seemed not much different from the rest of the buildings, scraped down to the gray bones by the elements. The windows were gone, without even slivers of glass remaining, and the porch had bowed and now had a stagnant pool of rainwater. The front door stood open at an angle, its lowermost hinges having rusted and snapped in two. Stepping carefully onto the rotten porch, I stepped inside and found myself inside the old living room. The floor was littered with trash, and chunks of plaster dropped from the ceiling. The television was gone, though a lighter patch in the shredded wallpaper marked its former location. The couch had collapsed and now seemed covered with mounds of some sort of gray mold or fungus. Ahead was the central hallway of the house, and I could see that the door to the basement had been wholly removed. I called out my brother's name and then stood for a moment, looking down into the unremitting darkness. Of course the power was out. It was probably disconnected long ago. But a flashlight lay on the floor, just outside the basement entrance. My brother's? The flashlight seemed quite new. I flicked it on and pointed it down into the basement, but it had penetrated far enough only to reveal the foot of the stairs. I called my brother's name again and waited. There was still no response. Assuming the basement was anything like assuming the basement was anything like as I had last seen it, my brother could have easily gotten hurt if he went down without his flashlight. He might even have been laying down there just beyond the stairs, unconscious. I had to make sure. Flashlight ready? I went into the basement. Stairs creaked beneath my feet. As I reached the bottom, and when my flashlight returned, only a slope heading deeper beneath the house. I knew my father had done quite a bit of work in the decades since we left. I went down. See if there's anything hidden on this page. I called for my brother. I walked to the left. I walked to the right. I called for my brother again. Only my own breathing echoed back through the chambers of the barren earth. I walked further into the darkness. Let's look at the chambers of barren earth. Around me, there was nothing but darkness. Uh-oh. I walked further onward. I called for my brother again and received no answer. I followed the sounds of digging. The path branched left and right. Let's follow the digging. Ooh, I think it got louder. In the distance, the sound of shoveling did not break its rhythm, as if the digger did not know or care I was there. Where was my brother? I followed the sound of digging. I went left. In the distance, the sound of the shovel did not break its rhythm. The digger did not know. Okay. Work further into the darkness. The smell of musty earth filled my nostrils. Around me there was nothing but darkness. Okay, let's try walking further onward. Okay, that got us nowhere. Follow the sound. We'll turn right. Was I going in circles? How would I even be able to tell? Let's see. Uh-oh. Flashlight went out. Here we go. Something's gonna happen. I did not find my brother. I do not know what to tell our mother. I do not know where to go from here, what to do. It is true, I gave up my search. But once I saw what lived there, and had been living there all these years, or more precisely what had grown there, I ran from the basement. Somehow, by my own luck, or by some other's design, I made it out of that darkness, though my brother has not. There is little chance, I think, that he may still be alive. Oh, there is a chance, I think, he may still be alive. My guilt is heavy, do not doubt that. But it is outweighed by the fear I experienced when I came to face with that terrible result of Father's attempted renovations of a rotted world. I once told my brother there was no such place as hell. I still believe that to be true, but wherever my little brother is now, I wonder if he's grown as tall as our father. My father's long, long legs. There you go. That was a interesting way to start off our Halloween adventure running through the month of October. I'll put a link to this if you want to try it yourself and see if you can come up with a different result. But I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope you enjoyed the, I guess you can call it a game. Web games are varied in what they do. I certainly thought it was a well done story. I really liked the flashlight effect. I kind of think maybe we could play it again and get something out of it, so it does have some replayability. So I'd say if you're looking for something to play with the lights out, this might be a good place to start on your scary adventure. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'll talk to you guys later. See ya.